Okay, hello everyone. We're going to get started here. Thanks for being here tonight. My name is Larissa Disler, and I am the Adult Services Librarian at the Galena Public Library in Galena, Illinois. And I'm also the person who runs and organizes Galena LitFest every year. This is our 7th year, and this is our first ever virtual LitFest. So we're excited about that. I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Rebecca Makkai. She is a Chicago-based author of novels, including the award winner and Pulitzer finalist, The Great Believers. She is also a short story author. Her short story collection is Music for Wartime. And she's also on the MFA faculties of the Sierra Nevada College and Northwestern University, and the artistic director of StoryStudio Chicago. So I'm going to turn this Zoom right over to her. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Larissa. I really appreciate it. I hope everyone can hear me okay. We good? Good. Excellent. I can see some of you. So those people, you know, I won't tell you who I can see, but if there's a problem, you can all wave frantically and then I'll know. It's great to be here, there, wherever we are, meeting virtually in this space. I'm in my office north of Chicago, and I just got new furniture in here, so I have sort of a mess behind me. I also, because I felt early on in all of this that I was doing Zoom events and they felt real but not real, so I decided that every time I did this, I was going to put on jewelry and I was going to have one glass of wine. So I have that here. So please join me if you'd like to. I have to say, I know not everyone is in Galena. But I just have to say that I love Galena. I get over there, my kids sometimes go to this wonderful farm camp in Elizabeth, Illinois, that's not too far away. But my introduction to Galena before I'd ever been there was that, and maybe people who are local will know who I'm talking about, there's a guy in Galena who does like a one-man show about the history of Galena, and I think he also does Mark Twain impersonations. And when I was maybe 10, for some reason, he took his one-man show about Galena to Chicago, and my whole grade went to see it. And we were singing all these songs afterwards about Galena, none of us having ever been there or really understanding what it was. So when I finally saw it, I was not disappointed at all. But I'm not going to sing the song, but I know like 3 songs about Galena from this one guy's one-man show. Anyway, sadly, not what I'm here to talk about today. But I am excited to talk to you about my book and about writing in general. And I'm particularly going to talk to you about The Great Believers, the book, my most recent novel, which came out in 2018. And which I'm still following around as it does its thing, even as I'm working on my next book. So what I'm gonna do is tell you a little bit about the origins of the book and some of the research that I went through to write it. My assumption is that some of you have read the book and some of you haven't. So that's where I'll aim my talk, and we'll avoid spoilers, but we can allude to things, certainly. So here's the story of how this book came to be. And if you know about it but haven't read it yet, or if you wandered in here and you don't know about it at all, it's the story of one group of friends, and particularly one guy named Yale Tishman. We follow him from 1985 into the 90s, over 7 years, as starting with the funeral of his first close friend to die of the AIDS epidemic. Yale is gay himself, he knows he's been at risk, and over the next 7 years, as the virus circles closer to him, his life both falls apart and takes on much greater meaning. Meanwhile, we have much shorter chapters in there, but every other chapter, this very thin thread, is the younger sister of that guy whose funeral started the book. Her name is Fiona, and she's in Paris in 2015. Ostensibly tracking down her estranged daughter, but ultimately finally coming face to face with all the trauma of the 80s and figuring out what to do with her PTSD. So this book, like most books, if you look at it after the fact, I think it would be impossible to figure out where it started. And here's what happened. I was in New York visiting my agent and doing some publishing world stuff. It was probably around 2013, 14, somewhere in there. And I had just submitted both my second and third books, a novel called The 100-Year House and then my story collection. And I felt like I just turned in 2 books, were in really good shape. My agent, who is very good at her job, asked me what I was going to write next, which felt like, I was still in the middle of editing these books I'd turned in. I couldn't believe she was asking me this. And I told her that I had absolutely no idea. And she said, well, you need to decide. And I have long held that she has magic witch powers. She did something, because I wasn't trying to think of what my next book would be, but in the cab on the ride between her apartment in Chelsea and Penn Station, which is not a long ride, I looked out the window of the cab and I saw this really striking young woman. She was very tall and thin, ebony skin, shaved head, just cloth everywhere, stunningly beautiful. She might not have been a model for sure, but she struck me as a model. And I started thinking about models as a concept, started thinking about artists' models, what it would have been like to be an artist's model, especially as a woman back in the time before women really had the resources to make their own art. How could you have had an artistic career as a muse rather than as an artist? What would that have been? And I decided this was the book I was going to write. I wanted someone looking back at her life as an artist's model. And if you have not read The Great Believers yet and you're wondering what on earth this has to do with it, it is in the book. There is in the book a woman, an older woman. She's at the end of her life in 1985, and she had been an artist's model in Paris before and after World War I. So, but in my mind, this was the whole book. I wanted this woman, I wanted to talk about all of her affairs with all these artists, all this juicy stuff. And the only thing I didn't want to do was set it back in that time. I felt like I had just written the novel I just turned in, The 100-Year House, was partly set in the 20s. I felt like I just did that. I'd rather have it set at the end of her life when she's looking back. It took me a good 2 weeks to actually do the math and realize she couldn't still be alive and that she couldn't have lived much past the 1980s. So I was still going to end up with a historical novel, but I could set it in the 80s, and that was different enough. So I figured at that point that if I had the art world of the 1980s, it made the most sense for me for her to be telling her stories about that time to someone in the art world, maybe someone she was giving her paintings to, something like that. So I figured I have the art world in the 1980s. This is an opportunity to write about the AIDS epidemic, maybe as a subplot. So several things happened then. One was, as I spent a year or so thinking about this book before I wrote it, because I had these other books to finish editing, and a book really needs some marination time. As I thought about it, one thing that occurred to me was that although I have no issue with any individual work that treats AIDS as a subplot, I don't love that that's a knee-jerk reaction we so often have, that AIDS is so often a subplot. It's so often something that happens off stage or to the side, maybe to teach the main character a lesson about life, and then, oh no, this person's gone. I really didn't want to do that. This was something I cared a great deal about. And I realized if I was going to do this, as terrifying as it was, I needed to look at it directly. I needed it to make it a focus, at least, of the novel. My interest in the AIDS epidemic, to be clear, is not from a lot of firsthand experience. In 1985, the year that the book starts, I was 7 years old. My parents tragically were not taking me out to gay bars in 1987. At the same time, I do believe that in the same sense that we have a native country, we have a native decade. And the 80s were my native decade. This was the crisis around which I formed my sense of morality, my understanding of government, my understanding of healthcare. I became aware of the world as the world was becoming aware of AIDS. I became aware of pop culture as pop culture was starting slowly to talk about AIDS. I did sex ed in high school in 1991, 1992. This is what we were talking about. So my interest in the topic was pre-existing and very strong, but not based on my own life particularly. So this was a terrifying prospect to deal with it directly. I knew that if I were going to do that, the mountains of research that I would need to do to get it right. And in this, you don't always have to go in to a fictional project with a deep commitment to realism or to the truth. You could make up a city, you could make up an epidemic. In this case, it was clearly important to me from the beginning because I'm dealing with lived history, with lived trauma. I'm writing across difference in so many ways. It was vital to me that I get this right on a granular level. So another thing that happened, the reason that this isn't ultimately a fun book about an artist's model, is that I started researching in two directions at this point. I still hadn't started writing yet. I started researching the art world of Paris in the teens and 20s. It was really fun. It was really juicy. It was really easy to find anything that I wanted to read, infinite biographies of these artists and so on. And it was great. I also started researching AIDS in Chicago, realizing that oddly, although I've had this pre-existing interest and although I have lived my whole life in Chicago, I knew significantly more about AIDS in New York and San Francisco than I knew about AIDS in Chicago. It's curious to me, but I figured, okay, I'm going to go to the library and I'm going to get the like 4 or 5 big, history of AIDS in Chicago books that turned out not to exist. That was shocking to me. It's still shocking to me. Was and is America's 3rd largest city. Big gay population, really hit hard by AIDS. I don't quite know why. I think part of it is that when someone sits down to tell the story of AIDS on the whole, they're drawn to talk about the coasts. And what history has been done in Chicago, and there is some, but it's been oral histories. It's been very specific histories at a certain bar, for instance, rather than the big nonfiction book about AIDS in Chicago. It still doesn't exist, and it's certainly not what I've written. So that actually was intriguing to me in many ways. Maybe in some sense because it was harder to find that information. I was more excited when I found anything. It became so compelling to me. And as I learned details about this city that I thought I knew pretty well, figuring out things that happened on streets and I had no idea they happened there, it became really compelling for me. It became a really compelling part of the story. I realized more and more that this was going to be a focus. The final thing that happened, though, to shift the focus of the book was that, and again, I hadn't started writing yet. All of this is, groundwork, right? I was getting ready to leave for an artist's residency. I was going to go stay at this artist's colony in Wyoming for 2 weeks and really finally start the book. And I had a few stories to edit, but this was going to be it. And I had really worked out what the story was going to be, that this older woman, it's the 1980s, she'd been an artist's model. Her story starts because she's watching the news and there's a painting up for auction that everyone's talking about. There's some debate about whether it's really from this famous artist or not. And she knows the truth because that's a painting of her. And so she contacts people and she starts telling her story. So I was getting ready to leave for Wyoming and my husband happened to ask me what exactly I was planning to write. And I don't always talk about my work before I do it, but I told him this about the woman and the news and the painting. And he very gently goes, honey, you know that's the plot of the movie Titanic? Right? So if you remember Titanic, there's this old lady and she's watching the news and they pull up that sketch and she's like, that's me and I'll tell the tale. And this is how the whole thing starts. And so he pointed this out to me and I'm going, oh, crap. Fortunately, I haven't written anything, right? But still, I'm getting on a plane to, this like toothpaste tube sized plane to land in rural Wyoming. Few other artists and writers around, but basically I'm alone for 2 weeks, supposed to start this book. And it is the most beautiful place I've ever been. There were elk and bald eagles and mountains, and I'm staring out my window going, oh my God, I don't have a book. I did a lot of yoga and I edited my stories. I only wrote one thing towards the Great Believers, more or less, while I was there. And here's what it was. In my research of Paris, actually, I had come across a book called Flappers, 6 Women of a Dangerous Generation by Judith McCrell. It's a wonderful book. And it's telling the stories of various, like Zelda Fitzgerald and the artists Tamara de Lempicka, Isadora Duncan, those people. And in it, really in passing, she quotes F. Scott Fitzgerald as saying, "We were the great believers," talking about his generation. And it was just that quote. Those of you who've read the book know that I have an epigraph in there from that same essay that's quite a bit longer. But it was just, "We were the great believers." And I was so flummoxed by that. I felt like this is not what I think of when I think of that generation. We think of them as really jaded, debauched. But what I was realizing, reading, was that this was the generation, and what Fitzgerald was talking about was the young men who'd gone to war with this great sense of American imperialism, then faced with years of trench warfare, the influenza of 1918. It's in the aftermath of all of that that the American writers we think of go to Paris. And this is when Gertrude Stein says to Hemingway, "You're all a lost generation." That's how we remember them. The contrast between the before and after there was fascinating for me. I was learning at the same time about this generation of artists who had come to Paris before World War I. It was the age of the Art Academy. People were coming from all over Europe, even with Fujita from Japan. People from America were coming to Paris. They were living in relative poverty, finding chosen family, making art. They had each other. It's this, period of youth and happiness. And then the war and the influenza roll through. And it's the aftermath of all of that that we think of when we think of them. The parallels, which were not the reasons I'd chosen these two eras, the parallels between that generation, that lost generation, and the lost generation of the early days of AIDS started to really strike me. With Chicago, again, you have a city where people would be coming from other places, coming from all over, finding each other, in many cases making art, living together as chosen family, finding this brief period of happiness before this epidemic rolls through. I knew that somewhere in there, in that echo chamber between these two ideas, was a book. So the one thing I wrote there in rural Wyoming, staring in despair out my window, was a letter that's not in the book, from the character who would become Nora, my older woman, to the character who would become Yale, my main character, talking about returning to Paris after the war and saying, "You have to understand that everyone was gone." And I walked around and no one was there. And that sense of emptiness, that sense of where did everyone go, that is something that permeates the book. It's something that permeates the first chapter in particular, if you've started to read or if you've read it. And I knew that somewhere in there, or I hoped that somewhere in there, you never know, I had a book. So I spent a great deal of time then as I wrote, simultaneous with the writing, a ton of research that went on. And because I didn't have those books to turn to, it actually, for me, was a blessing in disguise. Those books should exist. But for me personally, for my process, it worked out because it got me out from behind my desk much sooner than I would have preferred. I knew that if I wanted to get these details right about Chicago in specific, and not just end up writing about San Francisco, but put it in Chicago, which would have been very wrong, I needed to do archival research right away, getting into back, gay weeklies from the 80s, for instance. And I needed to do essentially oral history. I needed to find people who would sit down with me and talk to me about everything from what was it like to get tested in the 1980s to what was this one bar like, to what was the 1990 ACT UP demonstration in downtown Chicago like, what were the details of it. I ended up talking to doctors, nurses, lawyers, legal advocates, activists, journalists, historians, the art therapist from the AIDS unit at Illinois Masonic Hospital, absolutely everyone I could find. Everyone that I talked to at the end of our conversation, I was asking them who they thought I should talk to next. And often they'd recommend 2 or 3 people, and often 1 or 2 of those people was eager to talk. So some of those same people then, of course, read the book when it was done before it went to my editor. Because, you have your known unknowns, but the unknown unknowns that I wanted to make sure we caught. The moments, one of the notes I got was, we never would have been listening to Donna Summers in 1986. We were all really mad at her. Okay, all right, I'll take Donna Summers out. Things like that would make a difference for someone who had been there. And the fact that I have the support of readers who lived through this firsthand is entirely a credit to the people who helped me by lending me their time, either to talk about this all or to read the book before it went out into the world. So all of that said, this is a book that, you never know when you're writing something, if it's the worst thing you've ever written, if it's the best thing you've ever written, if anyone will get it, if you're making terrible mistakes. This is a book that, since it's come out, has taken me on a wild ride. It came out in 2018 in the US, and I could not have been happier with the reception. An interesting thing that's happened now is most of my European translations came out in 2020 or are coming out now. And it is certainly not a book that I wrote with any sense that another epidemic, another pandemic was on the horizon. But as people have read it on lockdown in Poland, in Germany, in France, this is a lot of what they're getting out of it. A lot of what they want to talk about is the parallels to what we're going through now. They also want to talk about our broken American healthcare system, which is always very interesting to me. This idea that, certainly it's an intentional part of the book, but to someone reading this book in France, it's like the subject of the book is how messed up is American healthcare. So that's been interesting too. We're hoping that it becomes a television show in the near future. It's been optioned, which is the first step of all that. So this has been an adventure, and it's a thrill to still be talking about it to readers not that far from home, and to, as I sit there and struggle mightily with this new manuscript that I'm working on, to know that my other books are out there doing their thing, and that readers are still here. So I thank you all for that. On that note, although I could blather on forever, I get very tired of my own voice. And I can tell you other stories for sure. I have several interesting ones if no one has questions, but I very much hope that you have questions. And I would love for you to type them or pipe up with them, whatever makes sense for you. And maybe what we could do too, I'm going to put it on gallery view so I can see if anyone. Here's what I'll do. While you're thinking of whether you have a question, I am going to tell you, because some of you at least are in Galena, I'm going to tell you a story that's slightly relevant to your neck of the woods, or it's very relevant to what is kind of your neck of the woods, if that makes sense. Which is to say that one of the things that has really been a further education in so many ways for me is that the book being done, as I've traveled around the country, back when I traveled, so almost a year ago and before that, wherever I went, it was fascinating to me either to hear stories of how AIDS affected that location from people in the audience, or in some cases because I was paired on stage with someone with a lot of local knowledge about the history of AIDS in that town. So for instance, it was the One City, One Read book for San Diego in 2019. And so they put me on stage in San Diego with, you know, the guy, the historian who knows all this stuff. And so as I'm there, I'm learning a lot about San Diego. I was in Dubuque, Iowa, not too far from Galena. And Dubuque, Iowa is, at least to people who don't know it, I think even to people who do, is not particularly a place that you would think of as having its own unique AIDS story. But I gave my talk, and at the end of it, at the back of the signing line, this one man was sort of lingering, sort of waiting to be the last person to talk to me, which is often scary because usually that's the person who's about to hand you their like 700-page sci-fi manuscript and be like, could you read this and get back to me? But in this case, he kind of waited very shyly, and he introduced himself, and he said that he had been the infectious disease specialist at one of the two big hospitals in Dubuque. And, you know, at that time, for the most part, young gay men, if you were a gay man in Dubuque, you probably would have left town and gone to Chicago or Minneapolis. But when you got sick, you went home. And so he treated dozens of young men in a relative vacuum. He didn't have the organizations, the grassroots support, the volunteers that we would have had in Chicago. He was just doing this himself. And I asked him if he'd ever written the story, talked about it, and he was like, no, I never really thought about it. And, oh my God, you have incredible history here. You have incredible local knowledge that you need to write down. You know, so I'm encouraging people wherever I go, you know, to look into the history of your own town, and don't assume that this was all New York. Don't assume this was all San Francisco. We have some wonderful questions now. This is what happens when I yak for a while. So yes, Ken is asking about the Pulitzer process. This is fun because I think most people have very little idea how it works, including me until recently. The Great Believers was one of two finalists, and plus there's one winner for the Pulitzer in 2019. The way it works is that, you know, the publisher is going to send pretty much everything that would be vaguely eligible to the Pulitzer Committee. And for each genre within the Pulitzer, so there's, you know, photojournalism, there's music, there are all these different things. There is a committee of maybe 4 or 5 people, I can't remember, who read through as much as they possibly can of those books. I did something similar. I was a judge for the National Book Award this past year, and you end up reading, you know, part of a lot of books. You end up finishing 200, 300 books. It's a ton of reading. A lot of, you know, the second something is lousy, you put it aside, you know, and you go, okay, good riddance, because I need to move on to the next one. It's a ton of reading that they do. They pass through their 3 top finalists along to the actual Pulitzer board. And this is the part that blows a lot of people's minds. The Pulitzer board is the journalism faculty of Columbia University in New York. That's who it is. It includes a couple of writers. You know, Junot Diaz is usually on it. I think Catherine Boo is on it. A couple of photographers, musicians, but it is mostly the journalism faculty of Columbia University. And they are the ones who, of those 3, picks the winner. I found out, you know, I knew what day it was being announced, and I'm always curious, and, you know, you kind of get this like, oh God, maybe sort of thing. So they only announced the winners. They have a kind of a live press conference. It was just in like a little meeting room at Columbia with a PowerPoint. they announced the winners, and I watched. I'd heard great things about the Richard Powers book that won. I wasn't surprised. And then about half an hour later, I found out on Twitter that I'd been a finalist. So one of the original judges just tagged me. It was like, congratulations to Rebecca, Makkai, and Tommy Orange, who were the 2 finalists. And I went, I don't know if this is real, because this person might be just some random person with a problem from off the street. So texting my agent going, is this real? But it's like all judging. It's wonderfully arbitrary. It's the tastes of a few individual people, and that's important for everyone to keep in mind with all these things. I encourage my students to keep that in mind, even as they're submitting their first work to a small literary journal. It's the taste of one person, 2 people. And it's great when it connects with someone, and if it doesn't mean anything. So, but it was cool. It was a trip. So Laurel is asking about my writing process. And Michael's also asking about my writing process. I'm going to see if I can kind of combine these into one elaborate question. Laurel's asking about the transition between short stories and novels. Michael's asking, what part of the research and prep process stays the same with each project and what changes with each one. And I think these are related. It's interesting, I was publishing short stories before I published any novels. And certainly I was writing short stories before I was writing novels. But then my short story collection was my 3rd book to come out, because I really didn't have a collection until after I had my 2 novels. And the funniest question I got all the time when my short story collection came out was, why did you suddenly switch from writing novels to writing short stories? No, I've been writing short stories since high school. This is not some change. This is just part of what I do. And I constantly write short stories. I still write short stories. Short stories should not be seen as just a training ground, certainly. They are their own art form. It really bothers me when someone kind of throws a short story collection out there as a warm-up act and then never writes a short story again. Like, come on, take it seriously. That said, one reason that they're great to start with is that you can see things through from beginning to end so many different times. You start to see what works in terms of arc. How do you finish something? How do you land the airplane? It's just so much easier to throw out 20 pages that aren't working than to throw out 300 pages that aren't working. And you got to do a lot of that, especially early on, also later. In many ways, it prepared me. There's still a transition in terms of, in a short story, you have a lot less work to do on depth of character, on context, on setting, perhaps. You have a lot more work to do on building a world with a few brush strokes. There are trade-offs. When I started writing novels, one mistake I was making was I was trying to establish character as quickly and as efficiently as I'd been doing in short stories, not really realizing that in a novel, first of all, I have pages and pages and pages to build character, but also that people expect that. People want that. They want the backstory. They want to know everything about this character. So it took me a while to really deepen my characters. So much is the same from project to project, just if nothing else, in that you always head in with no idea what you're doing. You always head in going, well, this will be fun. Maybe this one will be easier. And then going, no, this is the worst thing I've ever written. This is so hard. There's so much I don't know, whether that's about the topic. Right now, I'm spending all this time researching New Hampshire criminal law. Like, why did I choose this? Why New Hampshire? Why the criminal justice system? Why am I doing this to myself? But then I learn it, I get there. There's so much you don't know about this story too. How am I gonna how does this story work? What stays consistent and what you start to learn from project to project is what is your own process? How do you work best? Can I call myself on my bullshit early? When I go through the same, when I'm 30 pages in and I think it's not going anywhere, I've been here before. I do this. This is the thing I do, and I can just keep going and it's going to be fine. Here are the mistakes I tend to make. Here are the words I tend to overuse, things as simple as that. Certainly not everything takes as much research as The Great Believers, but most fiction takes some research, unless you're writing about really your own life. If you're going to have a character with a different job than you, if it's not the city you live in and the year you're writing it in, if you're not writing about someone who is exactly demographically like you, and probably not literally every character in your book is exactly demographically like you, because that would be weird. You know, you have research to do, whether it's psychological research, logistical research, historical research. And those things can be fun. My favorite historical research tool is that you can get the Sears catalog off eBay for any year that it was produced. So I've got like the 1929 Sears catalog, the 1955 Sears catalog, and you can find anything in it that existed in that year, basically. It's what it was called too, and how much it cost. Like, and that's not a couch, it's a Davenport. It's really fun. So, okay, I'm gonna look up here. Lisa is saying she noticed that I have a distinct voice in my writing. In the wartime, I love how that almost says maritime. I was like, maritime short stories. I don't remember writing this, the wartime short stories. Yeah, that's interesting. Voice is not something that I think about a ton. The Borrower, which is my first book, is a first person story. And so the voice there is really probably the voice of the character, and probably differs from maybe my own narrative voice in several ways. Partly that might be it, and also it was the first book I wrote. I wrote it in my 20s. It spent 10 years writing it. So, you know, it's not that it was a warm-up act specifically, you know, but certainly you evolve. You hope to evolve as a writer. You know, it's funny. I think the thing about voice, as well as the theme and everything, is you just really, really hope as an artist that what you see as ruts, readers see as themes and voice, right? Like, I'm like, oh my God, I sound like me. This is gross. I sound like I'm a broken record. I'm writing about artists again. I'm doing this thing again. And hopefully your readers see that more as some kind of consistency on your part. I think I have more consistency of theme maybe than a voice sometimes. I tend to write about artists and academics, not always, but a lot of times. And there's just certain things that interest me. But I like hearing that I have a voice. That's good. Barb was asking about when I researched, saying that I wrote and researched at the same time. Yeah, you know, and asking, you know, is it morning, afternoon, etc. I don't have a great writing schedule. I'm someone who writes whenever I can, as I can. I have, you know, my kids are 10 and 13 now, but they really qualified as young kids when I was working on this book. And you have to be able to write on the airport floor, or, you know, in Starbucks or in the pickup lane when your kid is napping. And so I definitely don't have a schedule, but there absolutely were times that, you know, you're writing, you hit a wall and you realize you have to research something before you can continue. So I'm going to stop and spend a long time Googling. There are other times when you're writing and you realize you can leave a blank for a while and come back to it. You're on a roll, don't go online, you're never going to come back. So I just leave something blank. In a lot of other cases, it was simply a matter of, you know, because so much of this was interviews, when were people free to meet? And someone says, I can meet you on Tuesday for lunch. I'm going to meet them on Tuesday for lunch, and that's my research. And you know, if I get writing in around that, that's great. But the, you know, the part of the book that I'm working on might have nothing to do with the part of the research that I'm talking to them about. I might have been working on the Paris stuff and they're telling me about HIV testing. So flexibility, I know there are people who thrive on routine, but given my life, I really have to thrive on chaos. I have no other choice. So just embracing it. My friend KP is asking what I'm reading now. Ooh, and is there anything I tend to recommend more than other things, undersold or underpublicized? I can finally talk about my reading again. So all of last year, as I was reading for the National Book Award, I could not talk about what I was reading if it was American fiction, which was all I had time to read. I couldn't post about it on social media. I couldn't recommend new books because it was public who the judges were. And if, you know, a judge for the National Book Award is saying, ooh, I like this book, that means something. But I can finally talk about books again. I'm reading two things that I love right now. One is a new novel by Julia Fine, who's a fantastic Chicago author. It's called The Upstairs House. And it's going to be out, I believe, in a week or two. It's a really weird, and just trust me on this. It's about a young mother dealing with postpartum psychosis, perhaps, or perhaps her house is actually being haunted by the ghost of the children's book author, Margaret Wise Brown, who wrote Goodnight Moon, or both. It is phenomenal. She told me about it when she was writing it, and I was like, this sounds so weird and so good. It's better than I ever imagined. I'm reading it partly because I'm gonna be her interviewer for her launch at Women and Children First in February. I'm very excited about that. It's a Chicago bookstore if you don't know it, but on Zoom. The other one, and KP, it's very appropriate that you asked this question because a mutual friend of ours named Pamela Ahrens is a wonderful writer whose books I'm always recommending. But the book that I'm reading of hers right now is, she's an amazing adult author. She's written a children's novel that I am blurbing. I'm providing a quote for the book, and it's amazing and I can't put it down. And I think that'll be out mid-year. But her name is spelled E-R-E-N-S, and her novel, The Virgins, is one of the weirder books you will have ever read if you read it. It is so good. It's a boarding school novel set in the 70s. It's very strange. It's spooky. It's so good. But those are the two things I'm reading right now, besides a million student manuscripts. And actually, the next question is someone asking me to tell you about StoryStudio Chicago, which I'm thrilled to do. So I did not start StoryStudio, but I am the artistic director there now and have been for the past few years. It is a nonprofit writing center in Chicago and online, providing writing education, specifically creative writing education, in all genres to all levels of writers and to all ages of writers. So from middle schoolers to adults. And people could do, for instance, take anything from a one session memoir class to a year-long novel class. We have a conference every fall. We have a festival workshop every August. We have a lot of cool nonprofit initiatives getting into underserved parts of the city. And it's really, really fun to be doing right now. I teach a year-long novel class there. And I was doing that before I took on my role as artistic director. I think this is my 9th year teaching this year-long novel class. Really advanced novelist, and it's application-based, and they're all amazing. And it's really fun now because a lot of them are getting published. Certainly some people are still working on their books, and sometimes I'll get the text like, this agent wants to talk to me, but they're getting published. One of my students, her debut novel was a New York Times notable book this year, which is so cool. Her name is Sahar Mustafa, and it's a book called The Beauty of Your Face. And it's an incredible book. And this was, one of the ones that I was working on in draft form. So it is really fulfilling. And I really love teaching. And if anyone wants to check out StoryStudio, I'm always posting stuff on social media from there, but if you get on the mailing list or follow us, if you're a writer or just a reader, we're starting a series. This is actually going to be really fun if anyone wants to come to this. On January 31st, so this Sunday, it's the first session of this series we're starting called The Geek Out, where basically one writer makes another writer read something that they've never read before. So in this case, I found out that my friend Christina Enriquez, the author of the Book of Unknown Americans, wonderful writer, had never read the short story The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. And so I am making her read it. She's going to read it this week. And then we are geeking out about it together. And so it's kind of a book club. People can ask questions and stuff and join in, but we're talking sort of from a writer perspective. Like, what did we notice? What did she do here? And it's going to be a quarterly thing. So even if you're not a writer, if you're just a reader, check it out. It's really fun. I'll try to get through the rest of these in the next couple minutes here. Chelsea is saying really, really nice things. Thank you. And all the stuff there. Yeah, there's stuff I haven't mentioned. There are cults, there are mother-daughter relationships, there are detectives. And she's saying, can you talk more about how you balance the narrative moving in and out of all these very big themes? I'm particularly interested in the decision to move in and out of the 80s and present day and the decision to integrate the cult. Yeah, I can say really quickly, the book that I started after this whole story that I told you at the beginning, it really was only set in the 1980s at first. I did not have this thread of these other chapters set in 2015 Paris. It was, I got muted somehow, sorry about that. Two different things changed my mind about that. One was, I really did have a lot of concern and a lot of ongoing thought about the question of appropriation. Who is able to tell what stories? Certainly no one's policing this. There's no, this is not like what my grandmother went through writing, my grandmother was an author also in communist Hungary. Feedback, pushback is not censorship. I hate it when people get carried away on that, but there is a genuine concern, not about getting in trouble, but about, am I doing right? Am I able to tell this story accurately, well? Am I stealing voice from other people? Should I be telling this story? Part of the answer to that was, can I do it well? Can I do the research? Part of my answer to that was, I felt like it was really bothering me that I was only writing from Yale's point of view. That felt like an attempt at ventriloquism in a way that was not helpful to the book. I felt that I wanted to incorporate a voice of a character who was more demographically like me, and to keep it, it was already a very broad book, but it wasn't only about the AIDS epidemic, but to keep it a book about many things. The other thing is that in my interviews, I was becoming obsessed with the idea of memory and the passage of time, the long arm of survivor's grief, or survivor's guilt, grief and survivor's guilt, both. The conversations I was having with people where they'd say something like, God, I haven't thought about this in 30 years, but. And I realized that I also wanted a section that was in what was then the present day. 2015 now feels like ancient history, right? But those two things came together, and I knew that I wanted this character, Fiona. To be fair, the one other thing that I had written in Wyoming way back was a failed short story about cults. I became really interested in this one real cult that I couldn't name in the book because cults apparently make a lot of their money by suing people for libel and slander. So I could not name them their actual name, but I've followed pretty closely what this cult actually is and where they are and everything. I had accidentally at one point in time eaten in a restaurant that was run by this cult. And from that point on became really fascinated with them and did a lot of research. I ended up using that cult theme, and for people who haven't read the book, this woman, Fiona's daughter, had joined a cult in Colorado and has escaped the cult and is now in Paris, and that's why she's there to find her. It became relevant for me, or I realized its relevance in that The Great Believers is ultimately, in many ways, a book about chosen family and actual family. What do we owe each other because we're biologically related? What do we owe each other because we've made promises to each other? What happens when you make that promise and then because you think someone's dying and they're still here 20 years later, all the ways that can be complicated. And what do we owe each other, you know, in chosen families as well as biological families, you know, and I didn't want those chosen families to always be great. You know, biological family is messed up, but chosen family is always, always good, because our job as authors is to complicate things. And here was an example of a chosen family that was really bad. Also, you know, dealing with those issues of motherhood and everything along with that. So, you know, those are the reasons I tried it. The reason I kept it is because it worked for me. I wanted a bit of a messy novel. I did not want everything tied up neatly. I did not want everything laser focused on a few issues, partly because I was committed to a very realistic novel, and you know, real life is messy. So I wanted all the baggage and real stuff in there too. I don't know if I can get to everything. I think maybe I can get the last two in here. So Ava is saying, I came across The Great Believers for a research paper. Very cool. Throughout my reading, I've noticed the feeling of being an observer of tragedy, a witness to the countless deaths at the hands of AIDS. I noticed this specifically in Fiona and with Yale as well. So my question is, how did you craft the deep feeling of loneliness and being an outsider to one's own life experience? Did you find inspiration from other works of literature, art based on the time, and their parallels to Rent? Cool. This sounds like you're gonna have a great paper. Seriously. So yeah, you know, I think simultaneously, and without spoilers, I have characters in the book who are observers to what's happening, but in many cases, those characters become, you know, it becomes a much, you know, those characters in many cases succumb to AIDS themselves. So it's not that they stay observers. Fiona certainly, and other people who have survived into 2015, I was working on the sense of them as observers and also the bearers of memory of what happened, which, as I was just saying in my last answer, became a really important theme for me. The way we remember, the way we witness, the way we memorialize, the way we observe. You know, I think that there is always a sense of watching, you know, in moments of tragedy, in moments of history, there is always this sort of surreal watching yourself from the outside thing that happens. That, you know, like my kids were watching as the Capitol was invaded a couple weeks ago. And of course, the thing I say to them is, we're watching history. This is really disturbing. It's starting trying to explain what's going on. They had all kinds of questions, but kept saying, you know, this is history and you're going to tell your grandchildren about this one day. Not in like a great way, you know, but in the sense that I had on 9/11 of going, I remember on 9/11, the thing that I told myself that calmed me down was, you're someone, and I was 23 or whatever, going, you're someone's grandmother watching the news. You're someone's grandmother watching the news. Meaning, you know, when I'm 80, this is what it will have been to me, or what it'll be to my grandchildren. I'm someone's grandmother watching the news. There's just that thing that we do, is my point. And certainly the conversations that I had with people really helped me understand the psychology of trauma, of survivorship, of survivor's guilt. You know, and I was talking to people who, in some cases, were diagnosed with HIV in, you know, 1985, as soon as you could be diagnosed, and assumed they had weeks to live, and are still here. And, you know, that psychology, the work of fiction is always that you're making these leaps of imaginative empathy. You're always saying, what would it be like? What would this be like? What's it like over here? That can only get you so far. And at a certain point, talking to people and hearing the sense of isolation, the sense of, you know, the burden of memory, all those things was absolutely what got me there. Other works of literature, Angels in America, Tony Kushner, those two plays. the original director of that play, Oscar Eustis, who's also the original director of Hamilton, was a graduate school professor of mine and spoke at the time, this was the 1999, spoke a ton about the way that play came to be. So I have sort of a craft obsession with it, as well as a subject obsession. Rent is not a show I know that well, oddly. I've watched it, but it didn't have, I like their parallels, but it's not something that I relied on a ton. I have, I believe on my website, a list of books that I used and recommend. Some of them are fairly obscure. Some of them are the obvious, And the Band Played On, which is the, wonderful original nonfiction book from 1987, things like that. So good luck with your paper. It sounds amazing. Yeah, so what I'll do, I'll answer Ken's question really quickly. At what point did you take your passion for writing and translate it into a career? Was it organic or deliberative? There are plenty of people who come to writing later in life and are absolutely brilliant. I happen to be a person who was writing from the time I could hold a pencil when I was 3, and I couldn't even make my letters, but I was trying. I would make puppet shows and force my friends to be in them. I would write plays and force my friends to be in them. It's just the way my brain works. And I think by around 8th grade, I knew I wanted to be a writer and started sending stories out into the world, submitting stories, I think when I was 22. Took a little while, as it should, to get published, but it was sort of a drive from very early on, which is, I always worry when I say that it makes it sound like that's somehow how it's supposed to be, or that most writers are like that. And I don't think that's the case at all, but for me, it's just, some people are just like, I'm a dancer, and they just come out that way, and it was just writing for me. I have not read plays well with others. I need to. And yeah, what I can end on is the teaser about the book I'm writing now. I mentioned the New Hampshire criminal justice system. Essentially, it is a group of adults reconvening for a retrial. There was a young woman who was murdered when they were in high school in New Hampshire at a boarding school. The wrong person is in jail, and he's finally gotten a retrial, and they are called back as witnesses. And they are not supposed to be talking to each other, but they are. And so it's like a cross in my mind between Serial, the podcast, and The Big Chill, and maybe the second half of It, and Hotel New Hampshire by John Irving. I'm supposed to get 2/3 of a draft to my agent in next week, so wish me luck. But I'm relatively excited about it right now. So, all right. Thank you all so much. This was a lovely break from everything else for me. Really appreciate it.